Today, I'm joined by the Director of the Environment and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. His book, Growth and Poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa, was published by the Oxford University Press, and a copy can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste in the description panel of this video. This link is provided to you by the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research. Dr. Channing, welcome.
Thank you, Anotida. I'm glad to be here.
Let me start by extending my belated congratulations on your appointment as the Director of the Environment and Production Technology Division. I understand that you previously served as Senior Research Fellow in the Development Strategy and Governance Division. How has been the work for you so far?
Oh, we're very busy at IFPRI and at the CGIAR. There's a major reform process going on, and so that takes a lot of time. And then at IFPRI, we've been very involved in COVID and COVID response, working with governments to see, how to respond to the crisis. So it's really been a very occupied time, and that's on top of almost all of the other stuff that we normally do at the International Food Policy Research Institute, longer term work, climate change work, other things like that.
This was a brilliant job that you did. I do understand that you had co-authors and co-editors, if not co-contributors to this whole big project. How did you pull this up, and how did you connect with all these other guys? How did you conceive the idea for this book?
Well, the book is really designed to address the question of, I think there's pretty broad consensus that, well, certainly broad consensus that there was very, very poor growth performance in Sub-Saharan Africa, starting in the 70s and certainly in the 80s and into the 90s. And then around 95, not fully recognized, there was a resurgence of growth, or at least things started to happen and began to take some speed in 2000. Through the 2000s, and there was then first trying to identify the growth, which I think has been reasonably done. But how beneficial was this growth? Did poor people benefit, or was this merely a reflection of wealthier people getting even wealthier, or relatively? We're speaking in relative terms here. But did it all accrue towards the top, or to the top, or were there benefits for people at living near the poverty line or below the poverty line? And that was the question that we wanted to address. I can move in a little bit on that, and if you'd like a little bit more. We don't think there's a lot of statistical fog in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's not exactly clear what's happening. There's not as many statistics as we would like. Sometimes the quality is not very good. Sort of other factors that come into play. And so, we felt like it's not really possible to just sort of sit in an office in Helsinki or Washington, D.C. or wherever and just download statistics from the World Wide Web and get a really good impression of what's going on inside the country. And so we agree with that. There are other analysts who at the time were sort of saying that it's just, there's no information that's really credibly available on Sub-Saharan African economies related to poverty and well-being, and that basically we just didn't know at all. And we disagreed with that as well. And we felt that if you know the country, you know the data, you know which data sources to trust, you know which data sources not to trust, you look across multiple data sources, then it's likely that a coherent picture starts to emerge. And so we went about trying to get these authors and co-authors for the chapters, the case studies. So, based on that information, we really felt that a case study approach was the right way to go. That you had to know the country, you had to know the data, you had to know the data source, you had to do a really careful job of looking through. And so we recruited people whom we thought would be well qualified to really look at these economies and make an assessment of has there been growth? And in many cases there had been. And has this growth led to poverty reduction as hoped. So that, in a nutshell, was the motivation for the book.
Your book includes 16 country case studies, which collectively represent nearly 75% of the Sub-Saharan African population.
Right.
And it makes an interesting observation that while monetary indicators improved in many countries, others are yet to succeed in the benefits of economic growth into the pockets of the poor and improving living standards.
Right.
Why does Africa show the highest growth prospects out of any other continent in the world? Because if we are to look at it, reports from the World Bank, from the IMF, from IFPRI itself do always show that regardless of the poverty rate, regardless of the number of people living in poverty, Africa generally always shows the highest stats in terms of growth prospects, in terms of GDP growth. Why is this so?
I think a lot of it has to do with the notion of catch up and whether they'll be able to do it. That if you're poor, then there's sort of a lot of ability to bring in institutions, bring in technologies, bring in ideas, and you have a fairly high growth ceiling. It was definitely not the case that Africa was growing quickly, in the 70s and 80s, or late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. In the 2000s, and also continuing, Ethiopia had very rapid growth for a long time. Mozambique, before it fell into other troubles, had quite rapid growth. A number of economies have been growing rapidly in Africa, and it can definitely be done. Kenya is now starting to move a little bit faster. So I think that the ceiling is there if a growth process can be put into place. Another thing that will drive it is just pure demographics. So if you've got 50% of the population under age 16 or under age 17, then you're going to get a lot of growth in the labor force just by aging. Of course, it's not going to contribute to growth if those people can't find jobs. But if they can find jobs, if you have a growth process, then you've got a lot of fuel for that process in terms of bringing in young people who can work and move a growth process forward. So that's the upside. It's definitely not guaranteed. I mean, experience definitely shows that. But there is an upside that's there. And it's really important for Africa to capture this growth sort of dividend, especially if birth rates are falling, right? Then you have this large young population, and they're moving from having 4 or 5 children per woman to around 2 to 3. Then your dependency, or the number of young people that you have to take care of as this big bulge of currently under 16s move into the labor force and are not fully replaced by more young children. Then you have this opportunity for growth that exists, and it's very important to grab it. This was an important factor in growth in China, for example, and in India as birth rates fell. But yet you have this young population moving into the labor force.
The existence of multilateral organizations and the popularization of these so-called SDGs and MDGs have become a very critical and defining component of the global economy. Which services could there be benefits from universalism in tackling poverty, and what are the trade-offs?
I mean, obviously, you do want to go after poverty, and first of all, it's perfectly clear that poverty is a multidimensional phenomenon, right? You can have monetary measures of poverty. How much are you able to afford to consume, or you actually consume? Children, things like infant mortality is a very, very personal level of poverty. If your children have a very high chance of dying in infancy, that's a deprivation. There's deprivations that are based on your access to social services. Can you send your kids to school? Do you have access to standard health care? All of these things relate to the level of well-being that an individual experiences. The level of agency that a person has in their life is strongly related to kind of their self-satisfaction. If they feel like they have a certain level of control over their own circumstances, that is sort of a much better way to live than when you feel sort of either beholden just to events outside of yourself, or you are totally at the mercy of somebody else in your village or your household or somewhere else. So those there's this whole notion of poverty as this multidimensional phenomenon, and then it does follow that a multi-pronged or a universal approach is what's required. You've got to, especially in the African context, be aware of the scope of the problem of the issue, right? We're not talking about a little bit of poverty here and there. We're talking about significant shares of the population, 25, 30, 40, up to 50% of the population living below a very basic absolute poverty line, where this absolute poverty line provides you with enough calories to survive, but probably not, and almost surely not, what we would consider an adequate and balanced diet in terms of micronutrients. So already you're even at the definition of poverty, you're not satisfying certain nutrient requirements that really you should be, and then a very, very basic notion of non-food expenditures that's required. Say you must take transport to get to work, you need to have a certain level of housing, you've got to buy clothes, all of these things that are required. And this is quite basic, and so that there's that poverty line that sits there that's reflecting this quite low standard of living. There's a large share of the population that lives below that, but in almost in every case, of all 16 cases, there's also a very large share that's living only 10, 15, 20, 25% above the poverty line. So they're not substantially, and this now we're focusing on the monetary measure, they're not substantially better. I mean, they're no non-poor. They can afford this very basic basket of goods, but they're often, their lives are quite precarious, right? Something could happen, a death in the family, a bad agricultural season, lose job, sickness, whatever it is, and if it's a person that's an earner or whatever, then you're falling right back into poverty. Given those numbers, it's universal in the sense of, just really, it's a huge project for the whole country to be working on to be able to raise the living standards of these very, very large shares of the population that are there.
Does a universal approach build the solidarity that can make it easier to justify public expenditure on anti-poverty measures?
Some form of solidarity is really required, right? And if you go to the exact opposite of solidarity, it's really damaging, right? You see it in Ethiopia right now. Was a sort of a star performer in terms of bringing down poverty and poverty rates, but and in certain parts of the country that I think probably not as effective. But we have this conflict going on within Ethiopia right now that is ruining living standards. It's ruining the lives of millions of people, and this is catastrophically bad for welfare, and it's going to last quite a while. The lack of social solidarity is a really big problem in Mozambique, where you had very rapid rates of economic growth for a long time. How much poverty reduction you were actually getting out was somewhat contested, but certainly there was quite a bit, especially in the early phases. And that all of these things are now no longer in play. So having that social solidarity really does help.
What evidence is there for causal connections and intersections between poverty and wider social problems? like homelessness, substance misuse, mental and physical health?
You know, if you look at happiness indicators, then by and large, you know, if your life is less precarious, then you tend to view yourself as better off. I think you know, if you go and you look, certainly, you know, at the levels that we're talking about, you know, homelessness is a concept. You know, obviously, there's some people who are outside of that not with their families and so forth. But at these very basic standards, you know, the things that you mentioned sort of remind me more of you know, a little bit more developed country, or you know,
Phenomenon,
problems.
yeah.
Yeah, you know, in rural areas of developing countries,
Nobody's got.
yeah, it's not nobody,
Yeah,
but you can have, you know, very
a few.
Yeah, reasonably functioning sort of social networks, you know, families that are okay and so forth, and yet they're very poor. So you know, this is something that, you know, this is a real challenge. That's part of universalism, is to raise those living standards, you know, and having that you know, that basis of, you know, functional villages, functional institutions, you know, sort of a family network, however it's pulled together or defined, that's functional, is helpful. Sometimes these institutions are not, you know, always what you know, sort of the you know, the way we view the world in terms of, say, women's empowerment. It's not doing exactly what we would want there, but it is useful to have these functional institutions as a basis for, you know, moving forward and development.
If we are to look at it, many of the governments in the Sub-Saharan African region have become so informal, and in as much as they are informal, they are so dominated and controlled by the government right down to the bottom. The government is absolute control and absolute power over everything. Most of the economies are command economies, and the government has got so much monopoly on how the economy is to be run. And so much so that the people solely depend, and desperately and strongly depend, more on government resources or on government connection for their day-to-day livelihoods, for their day-to-day life, for them to survive. And there is not so much dependency on the private sector. It's actually interconnected to such an extent that we now have the bigger problem of neo-patrimonialism, because governments have so much overarching power. What are the most effective and viable mechanisms for shifting the responsibility from the state to the employer in order to reduce poverty?
Well, certainly, you know, your most powerful lever in much of Africa for moving people out of poverty is in agriculture, right? This is where agricultural growth can be an extremely powerful lever.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because, you know, in Mozambique at the time, it's probably a little bit less now, but you know, something like 80% of the labor force was fully or partially employed in agriculture. In Mozambique is quite a poor country, and something like, you know, for poor populations, 50, 40, 50, 60, 70% of their income is spent on food, right? And so that you get it on both sides of the equation. If you have greater agricultural productivity and, you know, more efficient and effective agricultural sector, then you have a lever for increasing the incomes of large numbers of people, and they benefit from that fairly directly, in that you know, their consumption patterns are heavily skewed towards food. So you get this sort of dual side benefit from gains in the food system that are really very, very important. And the food system is the biggest employer in the world. So it's often, and especially in Africa, almost always, a very informal employer, right? You're sort of self-employed, or you work for your neighbor, or something like that. So the mechanisms for getting that to happen are a little bit different. There are, as you were alluding to, public versus private roles. I think one of the things that happened in the 80s and into the 90s, and there's a lot to complain about in terms of the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s, but they did remove a certain amount of sort of gratuitous or not very productive interventions in agriculture that did allow for some greater growth to actually occur, and that's part of the story of the benefits. So I think that there is this very important balance between the role of the market and allowing people to respond to incentives such that the agricultural sector is responsive and hopefully efficient and growing, and that so the market plays a big role there. But the state also has a role to play in provision of information, in getting the basic infrastructure. I mean, it's no good to be producing a whole bunch of food if there are no roads and you can't get it anywhere. You can't sell it, right? You can't sell a surplus if you don't have a road or an ability to move it to a place where there's demand, and that's a government responsibility. And then it's just with so many smallholders at very low levels of subsistence, the private sector will typically not spend a lot of time developing the right technologies, improved technologies, and so forth. So there are I think reasonably delineated public and private sector roles that are required to move people out of poverty, and agriculture is a really big one. Another really big one would be sort of informal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Channing. Viewers and listeners, this book, Growth and Poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa, was published by Oxford University Press. A free copy of this book can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste in the description panel of this video. This link is provided to you by the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research. Dr. Channing Arndt, thank you very much for your time and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Anotida, and good luck with your PhD program at UMass.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Right. Bye-bye.